speak louder. Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you to David and Pastors Matt and Jeff for welcoming me here and inviting me to come speak with everyone here at St. Paul's. I always think that it's important to put your cards on the table face up when giving this type of presentation, so I'll share with you that when I was at another gathering to give a presentation, one of the attendees asked me before I spoke if I was a radical or more balanced. I responded that I'm an extremist for justice and love. My guess is that some of you could also describe yourselves that way. That said, I would guess that we are a diverse group of people. Some of us have been working to achieve a just peace in Palestine, Israel for many years. Others of us may just be becoming familiar with the issue. Some of us may identify as Palestinian rights activists, others as supporters of Israel. Some of us identify as human rights activists or some combination of these. And I would guess that some people don't know what to think but want the violence in Palestine, Israel to end. It is my hope that this morning's conversation will lead all of us to be better informed, strengthened in our commitment to do the work for a just peace, supported by each other, and have ideas of how we can make a positive difference. And in the words of Pastor Matt from this morning, be bold in responding to the call for justice. My plan for this presentation is to share with you a bit about my recent journey to this troubled land, what I saw and experienced, and thoughts about what we can do here in the US to support a just peace. In that my time was spent on the West Bank, I will not be spending much time talking about Gaza this morning. But as most of you probably know, on January 26th, the International Court of Justice in The Hague ordered Israel to prevent acts of genocide against Palestinians and do more to help civilians, although it stopped short of calling for a ceasefire. Between October 7th, 2023 and July 18th, 2024, at least 38,848 Gazans have been killed, including over 15,000 children. Over 89,400 Gazans have been wounded, including almost 8,700 children. And over 10,000 people are missing from Israeli attacks on Gaza since October 7th. The revised death toll from the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel stands at 1,139 people and over 8,700 people injured. The World Health Organization warns that illness may ultimately kill more people in Gaza than Israel's offensive, with rates of infectious disease soaring. Israel has damaged or destroyed Gaza's essential water, sanitation, and health systems, and more than half of Gaza's homes have been destroyed or damaged. I and my colleagues are committed to and working for an end to the violence there and an immediate, complete, and permanent ceasefire. So let's begin. When talking about Palestine, Israel, the question is always where to begin. For where you begin can have an enormous impact on how you see what is going on right now. And context is critical for understanding this storyteller's perspective and what is influencing how and what I see, understand, and share with you. So I will give you a brief background on me so that you can more critically listen to what I say and be able to think about how this one person's experience and perspective are shaping their narrative. I grew up in a Reformed Jewish temple where the dominant theological tenet was the belief that all human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, and that we are God's partners in improving the world. Tikkun Olam, the repair of our world, was our mandate to bring about a world of justice, wholeness, and compassion. We learned about struggles for civil and human rights and were taught that we bear responsibility for working towards justice. The Jewish roots of our values were attributed to many different scholars, teachers, and writings, but those of Hillel were some of the first and most powerful lessons. Im ein ani li mi li, if I am not for myself, who am I? Ukhsha'ani la'atzmi, ma'ani. If I am only for myself, what am I? V'im lo achshav matai. And if not now, when? Was the most emphasized of them. And the second that I recall was, that which is hateful to you, do not do to others. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. My connection with Israel started as a child. Like most Jews of their generation, my parents were enthusiastic supporters of the state of Israel, and we grew up with a strong belief in and commitment to the state as the rightful national home of the Jewish people. The context was the possession, from our perspective as American Jews, the context to that possession as American Jews was World War II and the Holocaust. We believed that we had earned the right to our own country with the deaths of 6 million of our people. And though most Jews lived outside of Israel, we still saw it as a critical pillar in our current and future safety. If another Holocaust were to be threatened, we were taught that we could always run to this country that was there for us as Jews. My family was not in the Holocaust. We were from what was then the Soviet Union. But as my Russian, Ukrainian relatives will tell you, they did not feel that they were Russians, given that they carried the stamp Jew in their passport. Some of our family immigrated to Israel shortly after 1948, but my grandparents came to the US. Like many other high school and college students, I went to Israel for a summer in 1974 and felt the rush of being in a place where it was my tribe that was dominant. Just knowing as I walked down the streets that most of these people were Jewish, hearing Hebrew spoken everywhere that I went, celebrating the Sabbath and feeling the quiet of the holiday descending on the entire communities where I was staying, gave me a feeling of belonging as a Jew that I had never felt here in the States. And this, we were taught, was a land that had not had a people living there, and we were a people that had had no land. This land could be ours. In 1983, I returned to Israel and was considering moving there. I took a job working at the Bureau of the Advisor to the Prime Minister on the Status of Women, where I wrote their publication about battered women. I had no previous knowledge about the high rates of domestic violence in the country and its critical connection with the militarization of the entire state. The project was the first serious crack that I had experienced in the image and understanding of Israel that I had been taught. The following year, I joined a team of 4 researchers working for one of the Knesset members, Shulamit Aloni, the head of RATS, the Human Rights Party. The team had been brought together to write the first research overview for the government called Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, 1979 to 1983. We had access to the Israeli government and military archives, which held many documents that had been recently made available to the public. We read every document in Hebrew, Arabic, English, French, and German that were available to us at the time. It was through this work that my entire understanding of the state of Israel's origins and history began to break down. I learned that there had been 1.3 million Palestinians living on this land as of 1948, of which 750,000 were expelled and made refugees by Jewish militias and the new Israeli army, and that we engaged in horrendous ethnic cleansing to make this land our own. I was shaken to my core by the words of my own Jewish Israeli heroes, including this quote by David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel. Quote, "In our political argument abroad, we minimize Arab opposition to us, but let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. I insist on the truth, not out of a respect for scientific, but political realities. When we say that the Arabs are the aggressors and we defend ourselves, this is only half the truth. The fighting is only one aspect of the conflict, which is, in its essence, a political one. And politically, we are the aggressors, and they defend themselves," unquote. Again, this was David Ben-Gurion, who became the first Prime Minister of Israel. He wrote this prior to the establishment of the state. I ended up moving back to the US, and in 2002, a group of us from Oak Park created CJPIP, the Committee for a Just Peace in Palestine-Israel, to educate and activate people in our communities about the reality of life in Palestine-Israel, as we ourselves were continuing to learn from Palestinian, Israeli, international, national, and local journalists, activists, educators, researchers, artists, and community members. This past March, I decided to go to Palestine, Israel. I had wanted to return for many years to do peace work there to help ground and inform the work that we were doing here, and the time was right for me. I contacted an Israeli colleague who was working for the New Israel Fund, an Israeli philanthropy with an activism arm focused on democracy and human rights. What I would do was uncertain, but it likely would include being a part of something called protective presence, in which Israeli and international activists act as a buffer between the Israeli military, police, and settlers and the Palestinians. The protective presence strategy has been used increasingly over the past few years due to the uptick in settler attacks and military raids. When Palestinians resist these assaults through protests in the courts, they are often met with violence from Israeli military, police, and settlers. With the protective presence strategy, Israeli Jewish and international activists use nonviolent direct action, challenging settlers, confronting soldiers who are threatening Palestinians, and sometimes even using their bodies to nonviolently obstruct house demolitions, evictions, arrests, and assaults targeting Palestinians. Unlike Palestinians who, when they are arrested, are tried in Israeli military courts where they are convicted 99% of the time, Israelis and internationals are subject to Israeli civil courts where they receive greater protection. Over the past year, there has been a significant increase in the attacks on Palestinian villages around Ramallah, the Palestinian in central West Bank that serves as the de facto administrative capital of Palestine. Residents were being shot and beaten up, and homes, businesses, vehicles, and fields were being torched. My contact said that it might be helpful to have me work there and describe 3 types of protective presence work that might be needed. 1, the Israeli army was regularly breaking into Palestinian homes at night, ransacking them, and taking people, men, women, and children, to prison, most of whom are there under administrative detention without being charged. Having Israeli Jews and internationals sleeping in Palestinians' homes sometimes decreased the level of violence by the Israeli army. Not always, but enough to make it a needed action. It was also going to be olive harvest season, and having internationals and Israeli Jews accompany the farmers sometimes deterred the attacks from Israeli settlers who were trying to prevent the Palestinians from harvesting their olives. The settlers are often guarded by Israeli soldiers who will fire upon the Palestinians if they resist the settlers' attacks. And finally, accompanying Palestinian children to their schools was a needed protective presence action since they were being threatened and attacked as they walked from their homes. I was to fly to Israel on October 7th, find my way to East Jerusalem, and get onto the West Bank, and then contact my contact for further directions of where to go. When I arrived in Israel, I was picked up at the airport by a young Israeli friend. I had arranged to stay with her for one night and head out the next day. But as we drove to her home in Gedera, halfway between the airport and Gaza, the missiles from Hamas were exploding above our heads to the east and west. Kipat Barzel, she said to me, Iron Dome, the anti-rocket system for which US taxpayers had spent $2.6 billion over the past 10 years, was knocking out these short-range rockets coming from Gaza. When we got back to her home, we watched the news, and it was clear that there had been a horrible attack by Hamas, but I didn't know what was real and what was not from the Israeli TV news, which is quite similar to Fox News here in the US. But when I went online and read multiple news sources, the horror of the attack was clearly real. I heard about the attack on the people attending the concert and the killing and capture of Israelis in kibbutzim, the collective farm settlements near Gaza. I have a family living on a kibbutz close to Gaza, and I wondered if any of them had been hurt or captured. Sirens were going off and explosions were rattling the windows throughout the night. By the next day, the missiles were no longer falling anywhere near us, and had been replaced by Israeli fighter jets flying south to Gaza, only 40 kilometers away, where they were ravaging neighborhoods from north to south. Having watched and listened to reports and witnesses about the increasing stranglehold of Gaza over the past years, the seemingly ineffective efforts to stop the occupation, the never-ending land grab in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the increased killing of Palestinians in all of the occupied territories, that Hamas would carry out an attack on Israel was not a surprise. But like everyone else, I was shocked and horrified by their mass slaughter and kidnapping of Israelis. And I was mystified at how they had been able to reach so far into Israel. And there still were Hamas militants at large. But I was not around anyone with whom I could have this conversation. There was no context to be found anywhere on the news or in discussions with my friend. It was like being in the US after 9/11. I texted a friend of mine on my second night in Israel. Quote, "As you can imagine, the coverage on the televisions here are completely without any context other than the rightful horror, outrage, fear, and grief of the Jews, coupled with racist and dehumanizing characterizations of Palestinians. I am surrounded by people for whom I have great affection, but who have been thoroughly indoctrinated and believe wholeheartedly that the Arabs, Palestinians, are animals who should be slaughtered. But I also am watching as my friend is crying and know that she sleeps with a knife in her bed. She is terrified for herself and her children. There is no space to talk about anything but her fear and grief. Learning to listen intently to these fears and beliefs and responding in a way that has the potential to at least raise questions has taken more patience and grounding than I thought I had in me. And doing it while we are confronting such shock and pain of the current situation makes it even more difficult," unquote. Michael Svard, an Israeli human rights lawyer, wrote an article on October 16th in which he addressed this challenge in talking about the situation that day. Quote, "At what point in time do you start an article about the catastrophe unfolding now in the Gaza Strip? With the horrendous war crimes committed by Hamas on Saturday, October 7th, when its men carried out a mass slaughter of Israeli civilians, killing hundreds, kidnapping women, children, and the elderly, and violating every human moral code? When they seized control of Israeli villages on the Gaza border for hours and went door to door murdering their inhabitants and massacred partygoers at a music festival? Or should we start almost 16 years ago, when Israel imposed a brutal blockade of Gaza, unprecedented in the modern era, with the backing of the entire Western world over an area that is home to more than 2 million people, more than half of them children? 16 years in which Israel left Gazans deliberately on the brink of suffocation? Perhaps we should begin in 1967, when Gaza was conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War and put under a state of permanent occupation by a country that also operates an apartheid regime? Or should we go back to 1948, to the Nakba, to the enormous ethnic cleansing of Palestinians carried out by the newly born Jewish state? Activists and intellectuals on both sides stick to their tribal tents, some emphasizing the crimes of Israel and disgracefully dwarfing the crimes of Hamas, others denouncing the Palestinians and completely ignoring the inhuman context of the iron boot with which Israel has tread on the necks of Palestinians for 75 years, unquote. I share this with you because this theme of being able to recognize the pain and anguish of one group at the same time that you hold the pain and anguish of another, recognizing the radically different situations being faced by both groups, but we're trying to put a rank order to the fear and grief seems ludicrous. This theme and challenge kept coming up for me throughout the 5 weeks that were just beginning. On October 9th, 2 days after arriving, my contact told me that there was a change in the needs of the internationals and Israelis doing peace work in Palestine, Israel. Rather than working in the small towns around Ramallah, activists were being mobilized to support Palestinian shepherds in the West Bank. I knew what this was about. 3 days before I left for Palestine, Israel, the New York Times had published an article in which they described how Palestinian shepherding communities are being pushed out of their villages by Israeli settlers. Kerem Navot, an Israeli organization that monitors settlements, had reported that Israeli settlers were establishing large numbers of herding outposts near Palestinian villages, more than 20 in 2023 alone, covering more than 140 square miles of land where Palestinians were living. This massive land grab has been happening for decades, but the rate of land theft had increased dramatically over the past few years, and with all eyes on Gaza, the land grab was skyrocketing. So when my contact asked if I would be willing to join with the Protective Presence activists working in the shepherding communities, I said yes. I spent time in 4 shepherding communities in the central and northern Jordan Valley during the 5 weeks that I stayed in Palestine, Israel. Wadi Sik, Ain al-Rashash, Al-Marajat, and Al-Farsiya. The work was similar in each of the villages. Much of the time was spent sitting in tents or under a tree, watching the hills where Israeli settlers had built their encampments or full-blown settlements overlooking the Palestinian villages. Sometimes we would see them watching us in the village, standing in or near their trucks, often with their weapons in full view. We never knew when they would come into the villages, nor what they would do. Sometimes they would drive their tractors, trucks, or ATVs down the hills and stop, watch us, and then return to the hilltops. Other times, they'd drive into the villages, pull their vehicles within yards of us, get out, walk through the tents and homes, shouting at the Palestinians, always brandishing their automatic weapons and threatening to destroy their homes or kill them if they don't leave. While some of the time the aggression would end with threats, at other times there was serious physical violence. The shepherds also asked for activists to accompany them as they took their sheep and goat herds out to graze. Because much of the land around their villages where they had at one time grazed their flocks was now taken over by the settlers, they had to walk far from the villages to find somewhere for the animals to eat. We would sit in the valleys for 4 to 5 hours. Sometimes it was peaceful. Other times, the settlers would drive their vehicles into the middle of the herds, blow their horns or fire their weapons, and frighten the animals so that they would run off. At times, they attacked the shepherds, shooting them and beating them. Settlers also came into the villages and destroyed solar panels, smashed windows, broke water pipes, and destroyed the large tanks that were trucked in to provide water for the villages and their animals. Natural wells that Palestinians had used for years have been filled with boulders by the army, while settlers have commandeered other springs and pools, refusing to allow the Palestinians to access them. So all water has to be purchased and trucked into the villages. In one village in the northern Jordan Valley, we could see a new water pipe being installed by the municipality, but it will only be for use by the Jewish settlements. Besides destroying property, settlers regularly steal Palestinians' animals, and there is nothing that the Palestinians can do to stop them. One afternoon in Al-Farsiya, in the northern Jordan Valley, a settler came into the village and stole the tractor. The only way that the villagers could retrieve the tractor was to go to the police and pay a large sum of money for a trumped-up charge. Another day, a couple of the settlers went to the land of the farmer living next to the shepherd's village and stole his 50 cows. They simply went into his pastures and brought his cows to an area near the settlement and said that the cows were theirs. The farmer called one of the shepherds to tell him what had happened, and the shepherd told us, the activists. There were 5 of us at the village that day, so 3 of us drove up to the area in the hills where the cows were taken, while 2 of us stayed on to watch in the village. The 3 who left went to take pictures of the cows to document the theft and be able to present evidence to the police. But a group of the settlers decided not to allow this, and they attacked the activists, bashing in the face of one of them and roughing up the other 2, stealing their phones, as well as throwing a huge rock through the car's back window, destroying the back of the car. I share this story with you not only to give you a sense of the wanton theft that takes place, but also because you may be wondering why we did not contact the police. We did. We called the police when we heard about the theft of the cows, and after the 3 activists were attacked, we called them again. The police station is about 15 minutes away from the settlement in the Palestinian village. 2.5 hours later, a police officer showed up, went up to the settlement, had a coffee with them, by his account, and came down again a while later, refusing to even allow us to file a police report. Activists who have been doing this work for years told me that in the past there had been some police officers or army soldiers who would speak to the settlers when they were harassing or attacking the Palestinians. But this was not something that I observed in the 5 weeks that I was there. And I was told by the veteran activists that now there are only a handful of police or soldiers who are willing to respond supportively when Palestinians are being attacked, though we never know if someone will respond appropriately, and therefore we keep trying. Many of you are aware that the Israeli army is deployed around the settlements to protect their Jewish residents. But the army did not just protect the Jewish settlers. The army was an active participant in using violence and the threat of violence to expel the Palestinian villagers. One night around 11 p.m., after everyone had gone into their tents or houses, we were awakened by the sound of automatic gunfire in the village. People came running out of their tents and houses, screaming the names of older children who sleep on the water tanks or next to the animal pens. Villagers are afraid that settlers will come at night to destroy the water tanks or release the animals from their pens, and this is how they can be aware of it if and when this happens. Children were screaming and crying, and parents were frantic, shining flashlights into the darkness, searching for gunmen, but finding no one. After 45 minutes or so, we all returned to our tents or houses and tried to sleep. The next day, an army jeep pulled up in the village asking who owned the cars with the yellow license plates. In Palestine, Israel, Palestinians have to use white license plates, while Israelis are given yellow plates. The 4 Israelis and I went to speak with the soldiers, and they told us that we were in a military firing zone, that they were using this area as a war practice area, that they were using live ammunition and tanks, and that if we didn't get out, they would not be responsible for anything that happened to us. We told them that we knew that this was not a firing zone, that we have the maps of the firing zones provided by the Army. The senior officer responded, "I am the Army." We told them that there was a whole village there with children, elderly, shepherds, and their families. That is not our problem. We're telling the 5 of you that you should leave, and that is all that we need to do. One of the critical roles provided by the activists is documentation of everything that is happening. We always had our phones charged and ready to take photos or video of whatever was going on, and live streamed it when we were afraid that something might happen to us or our cameras before we were able to share the footage. We had body cameras when we needed to be able to film, even if our phones were taken or not able to be used. This documentation is used by human rights groups and journalists who are telling the story of what is happening in these communities. Photos and videos have also been used to compel the police to file a case against settlers, and at times have been a critical piece of evidence when the army and police lie, accusing the activists or Palestinians of something that we did not do. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Israeli forces have either accompanied or actively supported settlers in nearly half of the recent attacks on Palestinians. This was a common occurrence in the time that I was with the shepherding communities. Some of the times when settlers would come to disperse the flocks by driving into them when they grazed, Israeli military jeeps would sit next to the flocks, sometimes eating their lunch, watching the settlers blowing their horns, shooting their guns, and just wait until the settlers had done their damage and left, and then they drive off. Rabbi Arik Asherman is the founder of Rabbis for Human Rights and one of the leaders of the Protective Presence activists working with the shepherding communities. On one morning, Rabbi Asherman drove with another activist and me to Wadi Seek in the central Jordan Valley to meet with the shepherds and hear about an incident that had just happened. We heard about settlers who were camped out on a nearby hill, having come earlier in the day and fired at one of the tents. Luckily, no one was injured by their gunshots, though the bullets tore through the tent. They also stole the shepherds' phones. Rabbi Asherman and two of us drove to see if we could get photos of the settlers' trucks' license plates and speak with the Israeli soldiers who were stationed below the trucks and had likely been there when the shots were fired. I was instructed to take photos, and the other activist was doing live stream filming as we all got out of the car and walked over to the soldiers. The entire interaction from the time we got out of the car until we walked back to it was filmed and photographed. We drove back through another Palestinian village on a return to Wadi Sik, only to have the road blocked when we came around a bend by the Israeli soldiers with whom Rabbi Asherman had spoken earlier. And then, from down the hill, we could see two Israeli police cars coming towards us. The police got out, spoke to the soldiers, and then came over to our car, where they began to do an inspection of the vehicle, finding a broken taillight and issuing us a ticket for $250, telling us that the car had to be fixed or off the road in 6 hours, or it would be impounded. The police left, stopping at the soldiers' Jeep again, and then turned around and came back to us, telling us that Rabbi Asherman was now being arrested for attacking, kicking the Israeli soldiers and impeding them from doing their work, and he was put in the police car and taken to jail. We had everything on camera, so the charge didn't hold up. But once again, we were seeing Israeli military and police collaborating and lying to undermine justice and human rights, something that I had heard about and now witnessed. I usually went out for 4 days at a stretch, staying in the shepherding villages day and night. I would then return to Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to take a shower, clean my clothes, eat a full meal, and then head back out to the villages. One day, when I was back in Tel Aviv, I received a text from another activist who lived in Tel Aviv and knew that I had come back for the day, asking me if I wanted to join her on Kaplan that evening. Kaplan is a major street in Tel Aviv where the huge anti-government democracy demonstrations were taking place weekly prior to October 7th. It had been transformed into a new anti-government protest demanding that Israel's leaders do more to free the hostages being held in Gaza. I was glad that she asked and wanted to go with me. It was an intense, somber, and powerful experience. Large posters of all of the Jewish hostages, along with their names, ages, and where they are from, lined both sides of the street and were hanging from light posts and plastering bus stands. Many protesters and families of the hostages kept a vigil there all day and evening. I sat in a tent with Shmuel Brodich, whose daughter and 3 grandchildren had all been abducted from their home. He gave me a pin to wear that has all of their photos on it. We just sat there and listened and told him that we would work for a ceasefire, a just peace, and their release. It was heartbreaking. I looked at all of the photos, children, elderly, people of every age, and of course, I thought, this could be my family. The fear and dread were everywhere. As we walked away, the sense of despondency that I had kept at bay for weeks started seeping into my soul. Talking about the fear and dread being faced by the Palestinians as well was not an option in these tents. And that awareness of the incredible difficulty of holding both groups' pain and suffering, not engaging in a false equivalence that Palestinians as a people and Israelis as a people were facing the same level of threat or danger, but recognizing that there was an overwhelming sense of grief and loss and fear for both peoples, led me to retreat into myself for a day, trying to figure out how to put one foot in front of the other. Most of the activists with whom I was working had connections to someone who was killed or kidnapped, whether or not they were from family of them. They would rotate on and off shifts to attend funerals or just for some time to be quiet. It was helpful to talk with them, but it was not as if they had it down, this balancing of compassion, commitment, understanding. It never was easy. It isn't easy now. Since October 7th, 576 Palestinians have been killed on the West Bank, including 140 children, and more than 5,300 have been injured. In 2023, approximately 4,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes in the West Bank, with more than 800 forced out of their homes between October 7th and the beginning of November. I don't know how many have been exiled in the past 8 months. We are hearing reports daily that Israeli forces are raiding locations and attacking communities across the occupied West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. Of the 4 villages where I worked, Wadi Sik and Ain Rashash no longer exist. In Ain Rashash, the army put boulders in the road that lead into the village, preventing water from being able to be brought in. Once that happened, it was a matter of days until the villagers could no longer survive with their herds. They had to leave. After dismantling most of their structure, they left one afternoon. We, the activists, escaped at night, hidden from the settlers by the darkness. Wadi Sik had far more violent end. Settlers and army soldiers came into the village one afternoon after having threatened the villagers in the previous days and having told them to leave. They blindfolded, beat, tortured, and attempted to sexually assault the Palestinians, blindfolded, zip-tied, and roughed up the activists, and held all of them for hours in the buildings or animal pens in the village. When they were finally released, the Palestinians were so severely hurt that they had to be hospitalized. Al-Marajat, located in the central Jordan Valley between Ramallah and Jericho, asked the activists to stop coming. The level of violence from the settlers was escalating rapidly, and the settlers were particularly incensed at the presence of the activists, whom they consider to be traitors. The Palestinians felt that our presence might be exacerbating the violence, and so we left, though we are still in contact with them, and they are still there. Just a couple of days ago, I received a video from one of the Al-Marajat villagers showing the settlers who had come at night, running through their tents, screaming at them, and attacking them with wood batons and automatic weapons. And in Al-Farsiya, the violence is escalating. In December, I received a message from one of the activists, which I will read to you. Today, December 4th at 2 o'clock in the morning in Al-Farsiya, during a protective presence shift, settlers arrived, she gives their names, accompanied by a tractor, threw stones at the families' houses and entered the families' houses, threatened and attacked them. In the meantime, the tractor, which was driven by, gives the name of a settler, started turning over rocks in an attempt to plow about 20 meters away from the community houses. She gives the name of an activist, approached the tractor to understand what was happening. He was attacked with pepper spray sprayed directly into his eyes by, and gives the settler's name, and collapsed. Another activist heard his cries and came to cover him with his body, but he himself was beaten and stones were thrown at him. He needed medical treatment in a hospital. Another activist provided backup to the community and communication with relevant parties. The settlers ran away when the army and police came. And as for the Brodich family, with whose grandfather we sat under the tent on Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv, all members of the family were freed by Hamas on November 26th. So where do we go from here? On that day when I was feeling so low, I reread Michael Svard's article from which I quoted earlier and found these 2 sentences that I have now copied and taped to my Palestine-Israel bookshelf at home. Quote, "When we crawl out of the deep pit we are in, we will find ourselves again facing the truth written on the wall in bold letters, the same truth that has always been written on the wall and that everyone, it seems, is trying hard to ignore. There is no solution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine that is not based on respecting everyone's human rights, on ending the occupation, ending apartheid, ending the blockade, realizing the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, and upholding the provisions of international law by all." Unquote. There is no military solution. There is only a political solution based on justice and compassion for all human beings equally. A political solution that addresses the root causes of what is happening in both Gaza and the West Bank, the 75 years of Israeli military occupation and apartheid, and the US's support of this untenable and systemic oppression. Full stop. There will have to be truth and reconciliation. But before that, there has to be an end to this violence. a total and complete ceasefire. What can we do when this seems so overwhelming? There is a lot that's complicated about this situation, but this part is not. I'm going to suggest 4 things that you can do starting today. Some take more time than others. You figure out what you have the bandwidth to do, but do something. Do as much as you can. And I will send around a sign-up sheet. If you want me to send these suggestions to you, so you don't have to be writing now, I will do so afterwards. So for the first and most pressing action, contact your elected officials to call for an immediate, complete, and permanent ceasefire and humanitarian aid. You can do this repeatedly to your representatives and encourage your family and friends to do the same. There are a number of organizations that make this very easy for you to do. If you go to the website for Jewish Voice for Peace and select Take Action, it has a 2-click process to get you to the page where you can fill in your information and an email will be sent to your representatives. You can also pick up the phone and give them a quick call. We've spoken with representatives at the local, state, and national levels. They are hearing your voices. Even when they don't respond, they know how many people are calling or writing every day and what they are saying. Be in touch with them again and again. 2, send humanitarian aid. We received word from the Jordan Valley activists that more shepherding villages are drying up, having no more money to buy water. CJ PIP, the Committee for a Just Peace in Palestine, Israel, will send whatever money is donated through this presentation today through the new Israel Fund to the Jordan Valley activists to get water to the villages and support their human rights. I have a basket here which I'll pass out later. Every penny that you send, we will send on. 3, there are many actions taking place around the Chicago metro area. You can find out about them through signing up with the Chicago Coalition for Justice in Palestine on Facebook, or you can follow CJ PIP on Facebook. Go to them. Go to as many as you can. Our showing of support is critical and is being seen and heard. And I would just like to deviate for a second from my presentation to tell you a short story. When I was in Al-Farsiya, every morning we would gather around a table to have some tea before the shepherds would go off with their herds. And they have little phones that they catch up on what's happening, particularly in the other villages in the West Bank, what's happening in Gaza, and then what's happening in the world. And one morning, the mom had it on. I wasn't sitting near her. I was on the other side of the table. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing yelling in English. And I'm recognizing the voice. And I'm like, oh my God, that's Medea Benjamin, who is the head of Code Pink and a fabulous activist. And I'm hearing her while sitting in the Jordan Valley at a Palestinian's table, calling out. And where was she? She was in a hearing at the in Congress about Palestine, calling out for the Congress people to have the backbone to do the right thing for Palestine. And here's her voice coming through, and the Palestinian woman who doesn't speak English but can see the translation down below is saying, they're talking about us. In your Congress, they're talking about us. And I said, yes, they are. We're talking everywhere we can. And then I texted Medea to let her know that she and her colleagues was heard around the world, right? So if you ever think, what's the point of this? Who's hearing it? You never know what impact you're making. And finally, deepen your education and be informed. There are so many great sources of information available. Democracy Now!, AI, Jazeera, Al Jazeera, the Israeli-based 972 magazine, Electronic Intifada, and Mondoweiss are just a few. But read and question everything. Use multiple sources to try and verify what you're reading or hearing. Again, if you share with me your name and email address, I will send you the links to these sources if you're interested in following them. Thank you for listening. sorry, I thought of something else that I really wanted to share with you, and before we go into Q&A, if you don't mind, because it comes up in all of the Q&As, and I figure why not just deal with it straight out. One is anti-Semitism and how this is a very real threat, but how it's being weaponized to undermine truth and justice. So often when people know that I'm a Jew and that I'm speaking out against the brutality of the Israeli regime, they tell me that they're afraid of questioning or criticizing Israel, that when they have done so, they have been accused of being anti-Semitic. This is a dangerous notion, that criticizing the actions of a nation state is somehow off limits for anyone, Jew or non-Jew, and that when we do so, we're accused of being anti-Semitic, or in my case, a self-hating Jew. So let's unpack a couple of terms and understand how this is happening. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is hatred of and discrimination against Jews or dehumanizing stereotypes of Jewish people. There has been a significant and frightening increase in anti-Semitism in this past decade. The source of this anti-Semitism is primarily white nationalists. They have killed Jews in synagogues, raised Nazi symbols at the January 6th insurrection in DC, and other anti-Semitic rallies. Just a couple of months ago, there were anti-Semitic flyers put on cars right here on the north side of Chicago with a link to Goyim TV, a channel run by the Goyim Defense League, which promotes anti-Semitism and white supremacy. White supremacy weaves anti-Semitism together with anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, anti-black, anti-queer, and anti-Arab beliefs and attacks. Our work to stop anti-Semitism must be part of a larger effort to stop this harassment, violence, and oppression of any and all of these groups. And anti-Zionism. What is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism is the belief that political Zionism, a political ideology that says that Jews have greater rights and entitlements in Palestine, Israel than Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, greater rights than anyone else, is wrong. Anti-Zionism says that it is wrong. It is apartheid to systematically give one group of people in Israel greater rights than another just because of their religious or ethnic identity. Criticizing the Israeli government for its policies or actions is no different than criticizing any other nation state. And given that our tax dollars are being used to support Israel's actions, including its violent oppression of the Palestinians and the stealing and decimating of their land, it is not only acceptable, but I would argue the moral obligation for all of us to speak out against this and in support of justice. Thank you.
We're going to do Q&A. Could you repeat the question so that the mic picks
Sure.
it up when it happens? And so I'm just going to kick us off, Bekah.
Sure.
The Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is visiting the United States on this week.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe many people see him as a vile criminal, which, like a lot of political leaders, he is. And yet maybe he's that's too simple an explanation. Like if we get rid of Netanyahu, he's the reason the Gaza war keeps going on, and that there's so much more ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Can you share your perspective on this question of the Israeli leadership and who is responsible, and what is the potential for change, perhaps?
Got it. So just briefly, the question is Netanyahu the problem? Is it a larger problem? And what's the politics of Israel on this? So certainly Netanyahu is an enormous problem. But the problem, as I talked in my presentation, started before the State of Israel, where the demonization and vilification of non-Jews in Palestine started and was woven into the fabric of our society, of the Israeli society. Right? And so we had these programs to eliminate Palestinians, to push them off the land. Massive killings of Palestinians took place long before Netanyahu was in party. it was in power, long before Likud, the right wing, was in power, when the labor, which is seen as the left, the progressive folks, were in power. So Netanyahu is certainly a problem, and his coalition is made up of extreme right-wing nationalists. It is as if you can imagine in this country you had a leader who was a right-wing nationalist and had a coalition of organizations and people who believed in that, who were controlling much of what was going on in our national politics, right? The problem is that the left in Israel is very small and very quiet, much as contrasted with the right. And many leftists have left the country, many leftists have thrown up their hands, and many leftists who were my colleagues, who were activists when I was there back in the 80s, are no longer involved. There are organizations, growing number of both younger activists that are growing to fight this, and older activists who are putting their own bodies on the line and saying, you know what, our whole country is going to a horrible end. I have to put my body and life in this struggle. But right now, the political will in Israel does not have much to do with Palestinian human rights. Even those huge demonstrations that took place prior to October 7th, right? I was talking about Kaplan Street, where those were taking place, and they got press here in the United States as well. That was about a fear and anger among Jews because what was happening to the Israeli Supreme Court and how it was becoming more and more likely that Jewish human rights, Jewish civil rights were going to be diminished. It wasn't about Palestinian human rights. And the understanding of the way that the Reverend was talking this morning and that David mentioned earlier, that all of these struggles all come together on some level, is not there at all. The understanding that if we are not about Palestinians being free, we will not be free as Jews, was not part of the mentality among most Jews in Israel. And as I mentioned earlier, the information that Jews get in Israel that is on Israeli TV, on Israeli news, is such a contorted understanding. And I mean, people can know what else is going on. There is a very large, a very important Israeli organization called B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization, which wrote a report in Hebrew for people in Israel as well as the outside world about what is going on in the occupied territories and Israel. And they talked about how it is apartheid from the river to the sea, that this entire area is run under an apartheid system. So it's not that the information isn't available, but you would have to want to read it, and most people do not. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
It clarified a lot of stuff. I just wanted to ask you about the term you're using, Palestine. Is that Palestine hyphen Israel? And can you tell us a little bit about why you choose to use that term and what it means, and if it's okay for us to use that term, or if it's something that, I don't want to be misappropriating language that's not mine. So
Right.
Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. So I used to use the words Palestine and Israel, thinking of Israel as the area in the 1948 borders and Palestine as everything else outside of it, in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. What's happened in Palestine, Israel, over in the entirety of the land from the river to the sea, and B'Tselem's report really documents this well, as well as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, is that it has become, in essence, a single land being controlled by the Israeli government. And there are different rules, different powers in each of these different areas, but it, in essence, is a single land. And so that was why CJPIP, the organization I am part of, we used to say we were Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine. And then we decided, you know what, there isn't two separate entities. It is in Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel, and we decided, we've been calling it Israel and Palestine for a long time, we're going to call it Palestine-Israel. So we write it out with a slash in between. And as for whether or not you can or should use that term, as a Jew, I can push back in certain ways. that you certainly can push back at, but you have to know if you speak up about this issue, it's like the pastor said this morning, you have to be bold. I mean, you don't get a free pass because you have good intentions to not be attacked for being anti-Semitic or not understanding or not caring about Jews or whatever. So I encourage you to do so. But I also encourage you not just to start throwing out terms. I mean, I see a lot of people using the term settler colonialism, but they don't really understand what is settler colonialism and why is that an appropriate term. I mean, when David used it, he's absolutely right, but you need to understand why I'm using the term Palestine-Israel and not just Palestine or Israel. And then there are a lot of right-wing Jews who don't recognize the name Palestine, right? So they wouldn't recognize, they call it Judea and Samaria, right? The biblical names for it. But yes, I encourage you to do so, but I also encourage you to learn as much as you can and incorporate that in your conversations. And don't be afraid of being attacked for it. Know that it's going to happen and straighten your back.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to both of your time as like an activist in the shepherding communities, as well as when you were on like the Jewish side of the border. If there were any conversations about land distribution, what were maybe some of the opportunities and resistances in those conversations?
Can you just clarify what you mean by land distribution?
Yeah, redistribution, right? So if you were speaking with like shepherds down in those villages, I imagine they maybe had conversations about like what would it be like to get some of this land back, to halt some of the progression, and if you were working with activists on the Jewish side who were sympathetic to Palestinian causes, did they have any ideas about what it would be like in a just way to redistribute some of the
I mean, like, what is the final outcome? Like, how will this all be play out? You mean?
I mean, that'd be nice, but just if there are any.
I mean, everyone feels very strongly that I was working with, whether they were Palestinian or internationals or Israeli Jews who were working on this. Everyone believes that there should not be an apartheid system and that Palestinians who have lived and worked the land for generations and generations should not be being thrown off their land. And that Israelis, I mean, I have one of the people that I spent time with in Tel Aviv, I would stay in his apartment when I would come back, sends out a video every day, a little video every day. And the one he sent today was of him sitting with a Palestinian shepherd who is saying, like, what do we do? Where do we go? What is going to happen? Because now the uptick in settler violence with the army it's gotten so much worse than even when I was there. So what it would be like, it would mean that it doesn't matter whether you're Palestinian or Jewish, your rights to safety, your rights to having a homeland, your rights to having a place to live would be the same. And the people that I worked with, I work with people who are not who don't believe in nationalism either, right? And who are really pushing for this to be a land where everybody has equal rights, and some people want it under some sort of confederation, and other people want a binational state, and other people want two separate states. I don't have any marbles in that game. Like, I don't live there. It's not my country, right? It's not for me to weigh in on what it should be one way or the other. But whatever it is, it has to be on the basis of true, complete equality and human rights for every human being there, whatever they decide to do. And the United States can't be there as the dishonest broker weighing the scales in favor of Israeli right-wing nationalism, which is what we do. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually have two questions, but I won't be piggy. I'll just ask one first, which is, I know Zionism started back in the 1920s. So what was the thinking, the original thinking with the Zionists that they couldn't share the land with the Palestinians?
Well, I think the feeling, what was the feeling in the 1920s with Zionism that they couldn't share the land? I think the feeling was from the get-go that we needed our own land where we control everything, or else we will be subject to the whims of anti-Semitism. And at the time that Israel was established, the huge push for nationalism was taking place all over Europe, right? So the idea, like, to be safe, you need your own land, right? Everybody was trying to have their own national geographic land. So this fit right in with this push at the time. But the notion was that we are going to have this land, we will clean it of everything else, and then we will control it all, and everything will be fine. And you can't trust Arabs. You can't trust, Palestinians was not the word they used back then, but you can't trust the Arabs, so we need to make it free of Arabs. And there was a lot of fighting within, We're just learning about this more now. There was a lot of fighting within the Jewish community, even before the establishment of the State of Israel, as to whether or not having an actual geographic country was going to be in our best interest, or were we better off being a diasporic people where we are spread out, and our nationhood is a spiritual nationhood, but not a geographic land one. And the folks who believed in a geographic land approach under Theodore Herzl won out. But even here in the United States, there was a lot of fighting back and forth about this. There were a lot of people within the workers' movements who were fighting against the notion of a geographic home in Israel for Jews. They felt that it would make Jews less safe around the world. And they lost that fight, and then all of the voices of Jews, both in mainstream organizations. There were some of our mainstream organizations that were anti-Zionist early on. They got squashed, and there was a very concerted effort by both Israel and other Jewish organizations to squash those voices. So those of us who've been fighting about it for the past 30 years, we think like, oh, we started, it's like, no, we really didn't. People were doing this long ago, we just never heard about them. Yeah.
So you and your colleagues' nonviolent accompaniment with the Palestinians, that worked for quite a long ways.
Mm-hmm.
As you said, increasingly less so because of the military pairing up with the settlers.
Right.
So for you and your colleagues going forward, what's the next chapter in terms of how you physically, actively, in country, expect to be helping the Palestinians?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one because I'm not there, and I'm not having, those conversations take place in the tents or take place when you're out in the, with the shepherds, and you're sitting around and talking, and then there's planning that goes on. There's a lot of strategic planning that goes on with the different activist groups, and I'm not a part of them. So I don't know what the next steps are. I know that when I see these daily videos from this friend of mine, and I hear about what's going on in the different villages where I was, the violence is getting really, really horrible. I mean, it was horrible before. It's ramped up more and more, and the settlers have been fully armed by the government, and they are completely in collaboration now with the army. So what anyone can do, I don't know. But I think there is a sense, I know there is a sense like, well, you can't just say, it's so bad, we can't do anything, we're out of here. We're really sorry, right? But what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, I don't know. Yes?
What is your take on the historical efforts for a two-state solution and the future of potential for that?
So, from what I have read about what was said happened during the Oslo process and the various efforts to create a two-state solution and what really was going on and what the intention was by the Israelis, I don't think there was ever an intention for there to be a two-state solution on the part of the Israelis. I think there was always an intention to have peace talks, to have the semblance that we are trying to do it, and we are the only democracy in the Middle East, and of course we want to live in peace, that kind of thing. But there was never an intention to really have peace, to have two states that were equally independent and able to have equal human rights, equal civil rights, etc. There was never that intention. There was always the intention that in some way Israel would control what was going on with the Palestinian people. I just don't believe that that is something that they want. It's not just what I believe. I mean, we have enough documents going back showing exactly what people were saying, what they expect and what they don't expect. And at this point, it's just a mood issue. At this point, we have so many hundreds of thousands of Jews living in the West Bank. It's like Bantustan. There are these little areas of Palestinians living all over the place. But to create an area that would be a single state for Palestinians, you'd have to get rid of just hundreds of thousands of Jews. Could it happen? Yeah, it could happen. Anything can happen. Do I think that will happen? No. Do I think that there is any desire on the part of Israel and its government and its people to have that? No. That's what I think. Yeah.
I just have a question going back in history. You were saying it depends on where you start looking at the situation. Back in the 20s, I think when
Yeah.
So why, how was anyone able to just take land from another country back then?
Right. Right. So the question is, who controlled Israel before it was Israel? Who controlled that land? And was it a no man's land? And what I would kind of say it was an every man's land. That land has been taken over so many times by different empires and different countries and different nations over and over. At the time, in the 1920s, we had the British ruling there. And the British and the French had made an agreement about who was going to take what part of the land and who was going to control what parts of this territory. It had been the Ottomans prior to that, but it was all come 1948. It was, or prior to 1948, it was the British who were controlling it, sold out the Palestinians through something called the Balfour Declaration, where they said, you know what, this land here is going to be for the Jews, and this land here is going to be for the Palestinians, and we're declaring it now. And the majority of it was for the Jews, and a small part of it was going to be for the Palestinians. And then the 1948, Israel was established as a state by the UN, and then Arab states attacked. Where they're like, you've just said that 2/3 of our homeland is now Jewish homeland? No, and they attacked because they felt their home was
They occupied it.
because Arabs had been living there, right? And they said, right, and now they were told. It's kind of like somebody comes into Oak Park and tells me, you know what, you're now Berwyn. I'm like, wait, yeah, what do you mean I'm Berwyn?
Some parallels perhaps with the partition into Pakistan and India after the British rule.
Right.
Gave independence, and then arbitrarily here's the borders, and of course it was so chaotic
Right.
at the time because of the populations. I know it's not quite the same thing,
Mm-hmm.
but it's happened in history
Right.
where some entities, perhaps foreign to the populations, have decided these are your new borders and live with it.
Right.
Or in this case,
Right.
fight over it.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
First, I just wanted to say thank you for being here and sharing your experience and your story with us. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it. I was just curious if all the documentation that the activist groups do, all the documentation that the activist groups are producing, is there any public access way to kind of view that documentation? It's just kind of general public. Just out of curiosity, if there's an archive or something.
It's not that there is an archive or database that everybody can go into, but there are organizations like B'Tselem, like Human Rights Watch, that get all of these documents, and they do these reports, and all of their data is available for everyone to see.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I want to add my thanks to everyone else. This has been an enlightening and very powerful presentation. I'm very grateful. As a historian, I think it's particularly important to say where we start the story, and I'm grateful to you for where you started it. But perhaps as a Christian and as an American, I can start the story a little differently and see what you would think of it.
Sure.
So I would start the story with the papal bulls of the 15th century that justified the conquest of the New World and the advent of chattel slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that every horror that you've discussed in spades was done first by Christians conquering the New World, and second by Americans adopting the 15th century papal bulls as
Right.
the foundation of our property law in Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, which remains our law to this day, as well as the foundation of what's called federal Indian law, which is the law by which we claim a right to rule over the native nations of this continent.
Agreed.
Which is, in my opinion, as illegitimate and as illegal as the Israelis ruling over the Palestinians.
Right.
So when we say settler colonialism, I think it's very important for us as Americans and as Christians not to get self-righteous with regard to the Israelis, although what Israel is doing is horrific beyond belief. We ourselves have done the same thing and are still doing the same thing in our law.
Right. And I completely agree with you. All that I would say is that to the tune of $3.8 billion today, every year, your tax dollars are supporting what's going on in Palestine.
Yes.
So it is very relevant to us today, but I would completely agree with you. What we're doing parallels, what is being done in Israel parallels to what happened here.
And it's happening here.
and is happening here, yes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if Jewish Voice for Peace, and if not now, are planning to be involved in a demonstration at the time of the convention coming up.
Yes, we have signed on. Most of the groups I know of have already signed on to the I don't remember what the name of the organization is, but there is an organization that is coordinating on 2 different days, on both on Monday and on Thursday, major demonstrations against the Democrats and the party platform. And so yes, we have already signed on to it, and we are a part of it. Yeah. You know what? You hadn't asked anything. Or did you want? Oh, okay. Go ahead. You in the back.
You nicely summed up the worldview of the Reform Jews. So what input do the Orthodox Jews in Israel have into all of this? And does the fact that they're going to start drafting Orthodox Jews who've been excluded so far, is that going to make any difference, do you think?
Right. So the question is, what's the view of Orthodox Jews in Israel? And it's a huge spectrum, right? We have the Neturei Karta Orthodox Jews who believe that we should not have a state called Israel because it wasn't given to us by God. We took it by violence, and we shouldn't have it. So you've got those, which are a small group, and you have the ultra right-wing religious Jews who are out in the settlements, right? And then you have other Orthodox Jews who support the state of Israel, who support Zionism, who support all that's going on, but they just want to be left alone to do their studying in the yeshivas and in their communities. And they are, as you said, very upset because Israel has now said that they're going to draft Orthodox people into the army, which they had a free pass not to do in the past. And so there's been huge demonstrations by the Orthodox about it. And what will be, I don't know. They need more people. They need more soldiers because they're likely to have a war on 2 fronts, one with Hezbollah up in the north and continuing in Gaza and the West Bank. So, they need more people to kill, exactly, to kill. So I don't know what they're going to do. But I have no idea how it's going to play out. I mean, the politics here are enormous, and who's going to be in what coalition and what people are going to be willing to do. And the level of violence that is going up there within the Israeli society, not towards Palestinians, but towards other Jews, is going up as well. So is there going to be a civil war? I have no idea. It doesn't look good. What all I know is it doesn't look good. Yeah.
Timmy, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Because we're in a spiritual congregation, you're a spiritual community with a Jewish lifestyle. I'm wondering, what voices, contemporary or historical, in the Jewish tradition, are you inspired by, turn to for hope, for guidance? There's the political, there's the news, but in terms of like feeding your spirit, where do you go? Could you share?
Yeah, I mean, I have a small community that I belong to named Tzedek Chicago, which is actually getting much larger. It's an anti-Zionist synagogue here in Chicago, and I'm a part of that. But the truth is, where do I get most of my support is from fellow activists, and they are Jews as well as non-Jews. There are a lot of Christians, there are Muslims, there are Palestinians, there are other Arabs. I mean, it's a very wide array of people, and it's getting much wider very quickly. And it is from them that I gain my strength. Because they are they're walking the walk. You can talk about justice a lot, but when you actually walk it, that to me is what gives me the kind of energy that I need in order to keep going. But there's a Welsh philosopher whose statement I live by and gives me strength when I'm feeling pretty uncertain about where to go next. And his name's Raymond Williams, and he said, to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair inevitable. And that's how I feel. I feel that gives me, when I think about that, it's like, okay, do you want to be a radical for justice? And if so, your job is to make hope possible. That's your job. You want to despair? I can. I'm white. I live in the United States. I've got a house. I'm okay. I've got money. I'm okay. So I can despair because I'm okay. But that's not what it means to be a radical for justice. It means that it's my job to make hope possible. And the only way that I know to make hope possible is to become engaged and to be an activist in it.